Hello, my name is Andrew Lyons and I am the Principal Architect for Moodle LMS based in Perth, Western Australia. Thank you for asking me to speak at the Moodle Moot Italia 2023. Today I'm going to be talking about the web services in Moodle as they are now and what their future may look like going forwards from Moodle 4.4 onwards. I'll start with a bit of background on our current web services, which were originally introduced for Moodle 2.0 in around about 2009. Since they were introduced, there have been no significant changes to them. We added support for Ajax web services in Moodle 2.9, and we restructured the class locations in Moodle 4.2 to simplify developer experiences, but otherwise there have been no significant changes since their introduction. The web service framework was designed with support for multiple protocols in mind. When it originally shipped, it supported these three protocols: REST, SOAP, and XML-RPC. XML-RPC was recently removed from core, and at the time that this presentation was written, there were around about 400 service functions in the main or master branch of Moodle. The web service system does have its own self-built documentation system which documents each of the functions. So, on the surface, there is a lot of good in this system. As I say, it does support a range of protocols, that's REST, SOAP and XML-RPC. It does have support for reusable components, such as parameters and response types. It can support multiple authentication mechanisms, and already supports token-based authentication and cookies for the Ajax requests, and it does also support self-documentation. However, when we dig deep into these issues, we can identify a number of issues with them too. Whilst we support multiple protocols, none of them are really implemented correctly. For example, all REST responses end with a 200 OK response. They also lack consistent and reliable error reporting. We use query parameters rather than URI structure for all of the structure in the protocols. And we also use query parameters instead of verbs, putting each change for a feature into a different query parameter. Components aren't regularly reused, even though we can theoretically do so. There are very few uses of that in core. And the validation system can be quite confusing. For example, it's left to the developer who is implementing the web service to configure how it's going to work, and the errors that it emits can be quite hard to debug and understand. Although there is a documentation system, it doesn't always perform very well, especially now that we're getting more and more web services. And it only provides an HTML form of the documentation. It doesn't comply with any documentation standards or anything like that. And it can also be disabled, which can make writing an integration with Moodle even harder. So what comes next? How do we solve all of these issues? And how do we improve Moodle's web service infrastructure to better support the needs of our developers, our integration partners, and our other interested parties? This is where MDL 76834 comes in. This is our web service modernization project. It's a project which I've been working on for the past 6 months to try and improve the situation with web services and solve those issues. So what have we been looking at? Well, we've been looking at what an ideal web service system should look like for Moodle. If we were doing this again, what would we like to see? We've looked at a range of protocols, including REST, GraphQL, and remote procedure call systems like gRPC. We've also looked at some authentication options, including token-based authentication, OAuth 2, JWT, and cookies, which are required for Ajax. We've also tried to consider things like standards for documentation, standards that allow clients to be generated based on the documentation, and automatic validation of parameters, request bodies, and responses. We've also started to look at commonplace technologies which are new to Moodle, such as routing, dependency injection, and the use of PHP attributes. Using these areas of focus, we have then tried to think about a sensible direction for Moodle. So where are we now? After 6 months of looking at this and investigating, Where are we up to? Well, right now we do have a working proof of concept. You can see that on the issue. This working proof of concept supports REST, using the proper HTTP verbs and status codes, so that's get, put, post, delete, and the standard status codes. It also supports routing, and we're using the Slim framework to do so. We've added support for PSR15 compatible middleware, and we use PHP attributes to describe the routes. And finally, we have dependency injection there, so that when you create a new route, you can choose how you present and access the various parameters. Discovery of API routes is through self-discovery, that is, the route is created, and as long as the caches are cleared or the version is incremented, you don't need to do anything else. There's no longer any need to make an entry into a db/services.php file. Generation of API documentation is automatic, and it complies with the Open API 3.1 standard. And that means that you can use it with UIs like Swagger UI or even Postman, and it can be fed into an Open API compatible client generator, which makes it even easier to create new integrations with Moodle. So here's a brief look of how this API may look in the Swagger UI frontend. As you can see, this is just a standard Swagger UI frontend using the Open API JSON input, and we can add links to various documentation. We can support authorization to various test endpoints, and we can also break apart the various web services by their Moodle component. For example, core, core course, core user, or any other plugin that you choose to implement. Jumping into an implementation of a web service, you can see we have a file here. This is in core user. The location of this one is root API preferences.php within the classes directory. And that location automatically puts it into the user section down here, under user. So that namespace, the core user namespace, puts it under user, and a plugin such as mod forum would be under mod_forum. The class itself can have a route attribute if you want it to, and that can define any defaults, for example, the route path. And that comes down into /preferences. And then the actual method itself can also have, or must also have, a route attribute. And this one has a path of /preference, which is an optional path, which means that it gets appended to the class path. You can then add any title or description that you like, which will be then added to the documentation. You can describe each of the parameters. So this preference parameter here is a path parameter, and you can see that we can name it here. We can specify a standard Moodle parameter. You can also add descriptions and examples to that. We can also describe any responses. This is a reusable response, but you can put them in line, or you can create reusable responses. We also insert any common responses, for example 403 or 404 for forbidden and not found, and other responses also automatically added. Each of these can have their own examples, and they can all be reused. The actual method that this route is associated with is getPreferences, and you can see that we're passing in or taking in a response, a request, and the optional preference that was passed. We can then do some validation on there, check that the user has access to this context, for example, and then we can return the content that we would like. These parameters are sent in using the dependency injection. So if you did not want the preference there, for example, you could just remove it and it would be fine. If you only wanted the preference and you didn't want the response or the request, then you can do that as well, and you can place them in any order. In this case, we're returning what's called a payload response, which allows us to return any arbitrary array or standard class. And that can be then converted into a common format. So in this case, we're currently exporting to JSON, but in the future we could easily support XML or YAML or some other format if we needed to. These web services this is just the get one we've been looking at. That PHP attribute here, because this is an optional param, that produces 2 pieces of documentation. We also have, in that same file, we have a sort of post endpoints as well. Looking at the /preferences/preference name endpoint, you can see we have a try it out button, and if we use that try it out button, that would allow us to put in a preference and actually send a request. We can see the various responses that are detailed here. I've only got the 200 response on screen, but others will also be included. And you can see those in a variety of media types, and you can see other examples. You can also see any headers and their descriptions that may be returned. If we actually execute one of these, this is the /preferences endpoint, which fetches all preferences. By clicking on try it out, we can then press the execute button, and you can see that the curl request which would be used to execute that, so you can copy and paste that into your CLI tooling if you like. You can also see any request URLs that were used to access that, and the response body, and down here we also have the response headers. So that's a very brief dive into what we're looking at the moment, and the different options that we've assessed and where we are now. So I imagine people may have some questions, so I've tried to put together a few frequently asked questions. And the first one I'm going to look at is backwards compatibility. I will set your minds at rest, we will not be removing the legacy infrastructure in the near future. There will be a long deprecation period for the old system, spanning, I imagine, at least 2.5 years, if not longer. These timeframes are yet to be confirmed. This is just a guess based on what we think at the moment. At the moment, we do not think it will be possible to call legacy APIs from the new API system, and that's because they have a bit of a lack of structure, a lack of status codes, and a lack of verbs. So we would end up with lots of very unrelated web services for no real benefit. It may also be possible to call the new APIs using the legacy API system, but I don't think there's much benefit there, and it's not really our main focus at this time. But theoretically, it could be possible if there was need to do so. Why routing? Can we use it for something else? Well, routing is a very useful feature for Moodle going forward, and if we start to use it for web services, then it will give us a future option to serve standard Moodle pages using the same routing engine. And the proof of concept that we have on MDL 76834 does actually include a proof of concept to do this. So we can then start to support some pretty URLs, for example, course/view/123 or user/11/profile/course/10 instead of having lots of query parameters here. That generally is more accepted these days, and it makes it easier to work with those URLs. That's something we probably won't be doing for Moodle 4.4. It may be something we do for Moodle 4.5, but more likely for the release that comes after Moodle 4.5. And that's because there are likely to be some configuration changes to get the full support for this. Adding support for routing will probably require configuration changes on web service in the long run, but for web services, that particular aspect can be optional. We don't need to make those configuration changes just yet, but we will need to make them in the future to support standard pages. So at the moment we're looking at the different options for that. We will likely provide a Apache htaccess file, but that isn't always read, and it's better to configure this at the server itself anyway for performance reasons. Nginx also doesn't support such configurations, so that would need to be configured at the web server, and same with some other web server software. Now that's quite common, it's quite frequent, quite typical to do that for other applications like Drupal and WordPress anyway, so it's not something that is completely alien to many people. In terms of timeframes, these timeframes are not yet confirmed, but we are looking to introduce this new API for Moodle 4.4, and possibly we will continue to accept new legacy web service functions into Moodle Core until Moodle 4.5. and that's because Moodle 4.5 is an LTS release. However, after Moodle 4.5, we will no longer accept any legacy web services into Moodle Core. And in the future, we will obviously look to migrate all of those legacy web services and then later to deprecate and remove them. Now, that doesn't mean that you must use the new API for your own plugins. You can choose when you move over. As I say, we will continue to accept these into Core, certainly for the foreseeable future, for the next probably 6 to 12 months. And after that, we will still continue to support them for some time. So you don't have to make any immediate changes to your plugins, but you may want to do so. So the details of where this information is all at, MDL 76834. The issue is titled Web Service Modernization. If you have any questions, then please feel free to ask on that issue or in the Matrix developer chat for Moodle community developers. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Moot.